I'm going to start with an introduction. My name is Jeff Coomans, and I am the Senior Manager of New Product Development at Hawaiian Telcom. And my primary responsibility for the last approximately 3.5 years has been building a cloud services portfolio here at Hawaiian Telcom in the small and medium and enterprise corporate markets. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how you can connect your business to the cloud. And to start off, what we're going to do is a brief overview of what cloud services are and what they mean to your business. Then we're going to talk about the top applications that are currently being deployed in the small to medium-sized business market. We're going to go through how you get started down that road of migration, if you will, into the cloud. And then we're going to do some examples of migration and planning for taking some common services and deploying cloud in order to meet those needs. So I'm going to start off with a little disclaimer. We are not specifically endorsing any of the cloud service providers that are up here on the presentation today, other than obviously Hawaiian Telcom's and the partners that we provide here in the marketplace. But you will see some common names from providers that are here in the marketplace. So I'm going to start off with some cloud definitions. So the cloud can be a very general term, right? A lot of you, I'm sure, have heard about it. A lot of you are saying, well, what does that really mean? So if you look at all the services that are being offered out there that are branded with cloud, you can really just break them down into 3 major categories. The first category being infrastructure as a service, right? And that's simply renting shared computing resources. So if you want to think of it in terms of, I need a server, right? Or I need some computing power. Or I need some space in a rack where, there's a lot of bandwidth for my business. Those are the baseline infrastructure as a service products that are currently out there in the marketplace. So some good examples of these, for example, are things like Amazon Web Services. Those are, very widely deployed. And also, obviously, here locally, Hawaiian Telcom and DR Fortress, we have partnered and we offer a series of infrastructure as a service applications that are available locally. So the second layer, if you will, in cloud services is what we call platform as a service. And these are commonly used for software development. So if you have a group of software developers and they need a platform and they need to rapidly adopt, if you will, and agilely develop new applications, rather than buying the code, buying the coding platform, installing all the servers, a lot of them simply reach out to cloud providers in order to meet those needs. So common ones are obviously things like Force.com, very common in the marketplace, as well as Google. They offer a whole series of developer APIs so that you could rapidly deliver applications to the marketplace. And the last one that we're going to talk about and really focus on today is software as a service. Right? So software as a service is simply a method by which you take the business applications that you need and use every day, things like email, right? Things like collaboration, things like conferencing, and you simply deliver those, if you will, across a network. So rather than actually purchasing hardware, installing your own software, the rest of that, you can just simply purchase it as you need as a service. And some good examples of those are obviously things like Salesforce. A lot of companies use Salesforce as their CRM front end, and that's a very easy way to get, if you will, a cloud service that's pre-built today. Obviously, too, Hawaiian Telcom here locally, we have a hosted PBX product that we call Hosted Voice, and that is a replacement, if you will, for the traditional equipment, hardware, software, and everything that you buy and then install locally on premise. So if we look at what, customers, if we look at what the small businesses are currently saying about cloud services and what they expect and why they're adopting them, from a perception basis, if you look at it, most of the reasons are cost reduction, right? And then also productivity. They feel like they're going to be more productive, and which is another way of saying I'm going to get more out of fewer resources, right? I'm going to get more out of my investment. So this was actually a research paper that was done and developed by Microsoft, where they actually went out and talked to small businesses, everything from 2 employees all the way up to 250, and they did this nationwide. So if you look at some of the actual benefits that small and medium-sized businesses get, yes, you're going to get your cost reductions, right? So obviously, you can eliminate upfront hardware costs, right? I mean, there's hardware, servers, software that you don't have to buy when you get a cloud-based software as a service. But the other thing is you do lower your ongoing costs as well. As we all know, we buy a platform, we install it, we put it in, but that is not the big expense that you have ongoing, right? It's maintaining that equipment, if you will, over time, the IT services you need in order to configure and set it up. Even you add a couple of employees and all of a sudden you're now bringing your IT guy back in order to set things up. And then obviously technology obsolescence. We all buy this equipment, we expect it now to last for 3 to 5 years, or our tax person actually, that's the way they depreciate the asset, and yet somehow after a year and a half, right, we're caught in the upgrade cycle again, right? And that's something that we all know and recognize, and we would like to avoid. So from a productivity perspective, obviously when you look at cloud-based services, you're going to get greater availability, right? I mean, obviously, if you've got something email service that's in the cloud, you can reach it essentially from anywhere. And generally speaking, because it's cloud provided, it's in a big data center. It's usually availability is very high, as opposed to a single server or a couple of servers at your business. And if that goes down, your business goes down. Greater accessibility. I mean, obviously, things like email that are in the cloud. I can reach it from anywhere. If I've got a home device or an iPad or an iPhone or any of those devices, now I have access to the same applications regardless of the device that I choose to use, right? And then obviously improved functionality. If I'm a small business, I can generally afford a certain package to meet my business needs. I may not, however, be able to afford the package that allows me to compete, if you will, against some of my competitors that have, shall I say, larger investment dollars to spend in IT and greater return. When it's a cloud-based service, right, the investment is much smaller. You're paying on a monthly basis and you can take advantage of new functionality immediately when it becomes available, as opposed to wait until you reach that next software upgrade cycle. Scalability. This is one of the really, shall I say, fantastic enhancements. It used to be you get to a certain size, and if you wanted to expand beyond that, then you were going to have to make a large capital investment again. Well, with a cloud-based service, software as a service, it's much easier to expand or contract as needed. I mean, this is also really important here locally when we talk about the seasonality of our business here, and how many of the businesses here are driven, if you will, by those seasonal dollars. And then obviously, you can expand or contract on demand. If you need to add 15 users temporarily, if you're doing a project here locally and you need that extra software, you don't have to go out and buy it and then let it sit there unused. You can simply expand or contract on demand. Business continuity and disaster recovery. Cloud-based services, generally speaking, have greater business continuity than traditional servers on site. As I mentioned earlier, you have a single hardware and software platform, it goes down, your business is going to be impacted. If you've got a cloud-based service, generally speaking, those are running across distributed systems, and even many cases are geographically distributed too, so that if something happens in one location, there's a backup, if you will, for you to get access to. So you can keep your business running when an event does occur. The other thing is in a worst case scenario, right, if that data is stored up there, then if there is a local event, you can recover very quickly. You can get your data back, right, very rapidly if that information is available to you from the cloud. And then finally, security. So one of the things that is very, very challenging for all of us, and my cohort, if you will, is going to talk about, Mike, is the fact that keeping up with the security issues today is very, very difficult. As we all know, that is the one of the number one entry points, if you will, into your network is through those types of servers that you have on site. It's very easy to benefit, though, from a service provider's what we call defense in depth. Because we have regulatory and compliance requirements that we must meet, then we have security in depth. It's easier for us, if you will, to maintain that high level of security because we're mandated to, than it is obviously to chase that on your own. And the other is the most important thing is reducing your internet footprint. If your services are delivered from the cloud, right, and you don't have to expose your network, your local business, if you will, to threats because you're simply consuming rather than exposing those applications onto the net, it becomes easier to lower your internet footprint. That simply means that you're a black hole, if you will, in the water, right? It's much easier to maintain security if you're not exposing yourself than it is if you're actually, shall I say, delivering those services from your premise. So, what are the common, shall I say, applications and what kind of adoption are we seeing in the marketplace? We'll start off with adoption. If you look right now, 53%, if you will, of small businesses right now, when surveyed by Microsoft, said that they have deployed cloud services. And this is from the 26 employee and up space. So you'll notice in the 2 to 10 space, not quite as many. But in the 11 to 25, you'll also see the adoption ticking up. However, if you look at the next 3 years, what you're going to see is a rapid adoption of cloud-based services, right? And in many cases, when they surveyed, what they said was it's going to be 5 or more, if you will, cloud-based applications that they're looking at. So what are the top apps that are currently being deployed? Well, the number one is email. All of you are probably aware of cloud-based email. You probably all have it at home. If you have a Gmail account or a Yahoo account or anything of that nature, you are already using a cloud-based email. The difference is that businesses, if you will, are also rapidly moving away from their own internal email servers to cloud-based email. Unified communications. Obviously here locally, for approximately 3 years now, we've been offering a hosted PBX application that we call Hosted Voice that eliminates the need, if you will, for investment in your own phone system equipment. And instant messaging, unified messaging, those types of applications are all, if you will, part and parcel of that. And that has seen rapid adoption, not just here locally, but also, if you will, on the mainland. And then online backup. I'm sure many of you actually have some sort of online backup service. A lot of us have it at home, but also businesses now are looking at rapidly adopting it as well because the cost for traditional on-site backup solutions has been very prohibitive over time. Also, as you and I both know, if the data is here locally and it's at my business, if something happens, if there's a break-in or something of that nature, then that data is gone, right? And the most important thing about doing a backup is actually doing it somewhere remotely, securely. So those are the things that are being commonly deployed. What's coming, if you will, next? What's the next wave that's being adopted? Well, obviously file sharing and collaboration. Any of you that have a Dropbox account or anything of that nature, you'll see that this is actually, or Google Drive, or if you will, Microsoft SkyDrive, you'll see that this is also rapidly being adopted, right? Web conferencing. This is actually a service that we've been offering for quite a period of time here locally in the market, but we're seeing greater and greater adoption. And obviously, in the small to medium-sized business market, this is just another way, too, for you to collaborate with your peers. And then finally, project management and CRM. Locally here, Hawaiian Telcom has actually deployed a Salesforce implementation, so we use that for our CRM. And then from a project management, we have various project management tools, and one of which we also have is Rally, and that's specifically for software development. So we ourselves have rapidly adopted many of these applications for the same reasons that small businesses are looking at them. So, how do we actually get there? What's a roadmap, if you will, from taking what you have now, which is probably a couple of servers on-prem or maybe a little more than that, and actually migrating, if you will, to the cloud? So to start with, simple checklists, right? It's not complex, but there's a few things that you want to do when you get started, when you actually look at this and say, you know what, I need to investigate this. I want to see the details a little more clearly. So number one, I would recommend that you engage a managed services professional to look at it. The reason for this is you want to evaluate which app you're going to get the most bang for the buck for. You're going to understand really clearly what your business requirements are, and that's going to also dictate, what you have now is going to dictate how you get there. Third, also, you really want to look at the migration strategy. If you've got an email server, for example, on site, how do you get the information from there to the cloud-based service? Right? The second is you're going to want to look at choosing a vendor, right? So when you're making that, you're going to want to, one of the first choices that I commonly get asked from small businesses is, well, there's a lot of free services out there, right? Why shouldn't I just use those? We'll talk about that, but you're going to want to make that choice for yourself. It's not that free services aren't good, it's just you need to understand the implications of using free services when you do so. You're also going to want to evaluate public versus private, right? Public simply means that a whole bunch of customers are actually sharing the same infrastructure. Public is generally going to be the lowest cost alternative for you, simply because, guess what? It's cheaper for a service provider to deliver service to a whole bunch of customers over one infrastructure, right? Private, on the other hand, is a little more secure. And we'll talk about how you choose a public or private cloud. And then finally, you're going to want to look at the terms of service in the SLA. Obviously, if you're moving your business to the cloud, you want to make sure that it's available to you. And if something happens, you know step by step what's going to happen so that they can rectify the situation if it does arise. Finally, you're going to look at implementation. You're going to want to have a very clear cutover plan. It may be as simple as 3 items on a checklist when you do the day of the cutover, but you're going to want to know what happens A, B, and C so that you make sure that it goes smoothly. And then finally, training may be involved. I'll give you a good example. If you're moving something from, let's say, an email service on site that is very basic to something that is now, if you will, a complete cloud service exchange as well as integrated with your mobile devices from the cloud, guess what? Your end users, they're going to need some training because the functionality is probably greater and has better business benefits than traditionally they were getting. And then finally, you're going to want to look at management for the long term, right? You move to the cloud, you've simplified your infrastructure, you've simplified the way that you're delivering services to your employees and your customers, but you also want to make sure that ongoing moves, adds, changes, that sort of thing are clearly understood by both you and your administrator. And then finally, you're going to want to look at metrics and reporting. If you're charged for usage, right? For example, on online backup, how do you know how much you're using, right? You want to make sure that you're getting the information back, right? So that you can use that to run your business. There's a fine line between asking for a lot of information and getting the key metrics that will allow you, if you will, to more effectively use the service that you're paying for. So I'm going to start off with a simple example, right? And this is email. Many of you have probably already done this, but I still see a lot of local email servers here in Hawaii when we talk to customers. And this is one of the ones that if you're targeting apps, this is something that you should probably look at closely because there's a lot of benefits, if you will, from moving email into the cloud. So I'm going to start off, if you will, with the business needs, right? So some of the things that you're going to want to look for when you're doing specifically email is you're going to want to look at client support, right? What type of clients do you need to support from an email perspective? Is it just PCs, right? Maybe it's mobile devices. If so, what type of mobile devices? Can you get client support for those, right? You're going to want to make sure that obviously the devices that your business, your employees use are fully supported from that cloud service. The other thing you're going to want to look at is functionality, right? To start with, there are certain functionalities, obviously, basic ones that you're going to need, but you're also going to want to look at things like anti-spam, right? Do I need to be filtering that, right? You're also going to want to look at things like calendaring, right? Do I need to be able to share calendars and that sort of information? Most of the modern services today offer a full suite of those services, but some of the free ones don't, right? So you're going to want to make sure that those are things that you cover when you're looking at your business requirements. Synchronization is also a very common one. Raise your hand here, and I know it happens to me. If you retrieve your email on a device, but then you go to another device, and it looks like you never read the message. Yeah, right? Very common. Synchronization support is different across different types. So you really have to talk to, if you will, your employees, determine what their needs are, as well as talking, if you will, to the provider to make sure that that's on your checklist when you look at getting a hosted email application. Storage space is a big one. Let me tell you, at Hawaiian Telcom, we have a SharePoint, if you will, environment. We can share information, but yet people commonly still send very large attachments through email. Raise your hand if that's also a situation that you're all in, yeah. It's just because it's convenient, right? So the challenge is going to be storage space. You're going to want to make sure that when you talk to the cloud provider, that storage space is something that you cover. Typically what happens too is, what happens if there's overage, right? Do you get billed for it? Does that information just boot the old messages out, right? You're going to want to make sure that you cover that. And then, are there security or regulatory compliance issues that you have in your particular line of business? We all know in healthcare there are very specific rules. We also know that in government, we're included in that, right? We have certain requirements that we have to meet for archiving and storage. If you have those particular requirements, you're going to want to make sure that you cover them as well on your checklist when you're talking to vendors. So the next thing you're going to want to look at too are bandwidth requirements. If you have a server on site, right, your bandwidth is basically limited by the physical connection that you make. When you move things to the cloud, it is now more important that your internet connection or your private connection be sized appropriately to handle the extra traffic, right? Because you're just essentially picking up that server and you're moving it into the cloud. Now, sometimes you get a benefit for this, right? If you have an email server on site, for example, that all of your users remotely are coming in to use, performance can suffer, especially when they're all trying to get through that one internet connection to your place of business. And you might actually realize a benefit by moving it to the cloud. Vice versa, if everyone is local and they all pick that information up just in your office, then you might actually want to look at the bandwidth connection and say, am I sized appropriately, right? Typically, when you look at email and you look at the clients that are available, it's around 1 to 7 kilobits per second per user at peak usage. So you can use that as a general rule of thumb. It really depends on whether or not, what type of client you're using and what type of user you are, whether you're low usage or heavy usage. But that's a good rule of thumb that you can actually use. And then finally, you're going to want a migration strategy. This is the old garbage in, garbage out scenario where you buy, back in the day it used to be that you bought a new platform, you got new hardware, you got new software, you just installed it, and then you migrate all the data over, and guess what? You didn't realize the benefit you expected because the data was not clean, right? So again, when you do this type of migration, if you're going to migrate to the cloud, what you don't want to do is give the service provider, if you will, a list of users and 20% of them are no longer valid, right? Obviously, too, you'll be paying for services that you don't need if you've got a whole bunch of extra users that are no longer applicable. If you've got old business units, for example, an old sales department that you don't use anymore, you're going to want to clean that data out before you give it over to the service provider. A lot of that times, people refer to that as metadata. It's information about the data, right? And then you're going to want to look at archival for old messages. There is a tendency to want to try and migrate all of the old messages into the cloud, right? And you can do that, and there are ways of actually doing it. However, one of the recommended practices, especially for small to medium-sized businesses, is to actually look at how they can archive the old messages and keep them locally and start clean, if you will, in the cloud service. It's not that it's not possible, but if you really need to do that, you're going to want to talk to your professional about how you do that migration strategy. And then finally, there will be a cutover date, right? You'll go from one platform to the other platform. And you want to make sure that when that happens, that the mail doesn't get interrupted, right? So there's going to be a point in time where your mail record is going to point from you to your cloud service provider. And you want to make sure you time that appropriately so it doesn't happen at, let's say, for example, 8 a.m. on Monday morning. And messages, if you will, get delayed. So from a vendor perspective, what are the things that you want to actually look for? So number one, free versus paid. So the one thing I'm going to mention here, and it's very important, is that if it's free, you're not the customer. Somebody else is the customer, right? So if you look at a lot of the free services, who are the actual customers that benefit from those? It's the advertising model, right? That's who benefits, the advertisers and the rest who spend the money, if you will, so that Google and the rest of them can provide you those types of services. Again, it's a very solid model. It's great. A lot of those services are very functional, very useful. I myself use Google in my personal account. However, from a business perspective, there is a danger there. From an information leakage perspective, information about your business will make it out. That's the value, if you will, to the advertisers is they get that information, right? Now, if that's okay with you, right, and for many small businesses it is, then that's fine. On the other hand, if that, from a compliance or security perspective, is not okay with you, then really you should be looking at a paid-for service. Now, there's different types of paid-for, right? I mean, I'll give you an example. Here at Hawaiian Telcom, when we offer internet access service to small businesses, part of that actually includes, basic email functionality, right? So you could consider that a paid service. Why? Because it comes, if you will, with your package of internet service. But if you want, extended functionality, like a true, if you will, hosted exchange environment, you're going to want to pay for that, right? Second, public versus private. I mentioned this earlier, especially in the small business market, really most companies are going to be looking at public clouds, right? And that's just because, again, from a cost perspective, it's much easier to spread that cost across a large base of customers, and therefore give you, the greatest value for the dollar that you're spending. On the other hand, if you have great security concerns, if you have lots of applications that you're going to host, if you will, with a provider, then or if compliance issues are there, you may actually want to talk to them about a private cloud, in which case only your company, if you will, and only your users are using that infrastructure. They're essentially building the private cloud just for you. But security level and compliance, a lot of times, are what dictate whether you're going to pick a private cloud or not. And then finally, terms of service and SLAs, right? So if you're going to move your business to the cloud, one of the things that you're going to want to talk to them about is availability. Is it going to be there when I need it, right? So obviously, from an SLA perspective, if it's not, what are you going to do for me to compensate me for the fact that the service is out, right? From a performance perspective, right? On email, right, generally speaking, if it's another 20 seconds, not that big of a deal to me as a business. On the other hand, if I'm trying to upload something and send an email and it takes me 45 minutes to do so because there's a large attachment, that's an impact to my business as well. You want to make sure that you talk to them about any kind of performance SLA that they're going to provide as part of that service. Data ownership is a big deal. And again, not as much on a private service that you're paying for as it is for a free service. So who owns the data, right? If, for example, you decide that you no longer want to use this service and you're going to end your contract, what happens to that data that you've loaded up there? Do they own it or do you own it, right? You want to make sure that you actually have that discussion when you talk to a vendor. And then obviously contract termination. What happens if you come up on term at the end of the contract? What is the process by either renewing or getting out and then potentially migrating the service over to another provider? Again, that also has to do with data ownership. If they own the data, generally speaking, there's not a very good strategy for contract termination, right? And then finally, response and repair times. If something does go wrong in their data center, right, which is much less likely, if you will, to go wrong on, if you will, a single server environment. But if something does happen, right, what are their response and repair times? Right? You're going to want to know that. You're going to, just like you would ask, if you will, your IT guy, okay, if the server went down, how fast can I get back up? You're going to want to ask the exact same questions, and you're going to want to make sure that you see it in your actual contract. So I've talked about email a little bit, right? Some of the things that you want to look for from a planning perspective, the things that you're going to want to talk about when you're talking to a vendor. So I'm going to do the exact same thing now, but I'm going to shift gears and I'm going to talk about online backup, right? So some of the things I've already talked about obviously apply to both, but what I'm going to show you is some of the differences or what's a little bit unique, if you will, for online backup. So to begin with, again, you're going to want to look at your business needs, and I highly suggest that you do this with a managed services professional. They're going to really help you step through this particular process. But number one, you're going to want to know about platform support. Obviously, if you've got a mixed environment, which most of us do now, you've got a Mac, you've got PC, you've got Linux, you've got all of those different, if you will, servers. You're going to want to make sure that those platforms are supported. And it's not just the OS necessarily. Sometimes it can be specific hardware as well. I'll give you an example. My wife and I, she runs a small business from our house, and I have, if you will, a server. And that particular server is special, right? Is a hardware-built device that I bought specifically to do what we needed to do. And it was a 2 to 3 day conversation with an online backup provider to make sure that they could support our particular configuration. And that was for one server that was bought off the web, right? Nothing special, just a standard product that you could buy off the web. You're going to want to talk about functionality for online backup. A lot of us just think, oh, well, what kind of functionality do we need when we just want to back stuff up? Well, importantly, you're going to want to talk about, how automated it is. Does the client work in the background? If it does work in the background, right, do I have to have my sleep mode off for it to work, hibernate off, or is it going to work no matter what? Or will it kick the system over, if you will, when it's in hibernate mode? You're going to talk about incremental versus archival. You're going to want to make sure that, at least for most small business environments, you're going to look for an incremental path where you do one large backup and then only the changes are what's sent, if you will, up to the service provider. You want to talk to them about that because if it's a complete backup every time, guess what? You're going to burn a lot of bandwidth sending that information up every single time. One of the most important things you want to talk to them about is encryption. I've had this personal experience too when we were shopping around, if you will, for our small business. Not all companies in the cloud treat encryption the same way. There's a well-regarded security expert named Steve Gibson. He's on a show. He's got a podcast called Twit. And he used an acronym that I like, which is called Trust No One, right? And that means that essentially you are the only one that has the encryption keys. When you send that data up, no one, that company has absolutely zero access to your information. And that information to them just looks like random bits, right? You're going to want to make sure that that's the type of encryption that you have for the data so that that information cannot accidentally leak out, right? And believe it or not, there are some major service providers out there right now that do not follow this, if you will, trust no one policy. Obviously, you're going to want to talk about storage space. What I discovered when doing this is if you have a terabit of storage and you're a business, they really do charge quite a bit for a terabit of storage. On the other hand, after we worked it out with them, they were very reasonable in terms of shall I say, additional storage pricing as opposed to just what was published on their website. But you do want to make sure that if you're going to back up, not just the servers, but every PC, because we all know there's a lot of local information on PCs, that you do that calculation to make sure that you get your price right so you don't get stuck with overage afterwards. And then obviously security and regulatory compliance. Where do they store this stuff? How is this stuff stored? That kind of goes hand in hand with the encryption. But if you have those kind of regulatory requirements like we do, you have to make sure that you actually cover them. And then obviously recovery. So for me, one of the keys is being able to recover the information very fast. That is something that you're going to want to talk to them about because there are different recovery methods. And if you can only recover over the network link, it does take some time to get your data back. Bandwidth requirements. When you're doing data backup, what you really want to look for is to make sure that that app is bandwidth tunable, if you will. You don't want a backup sucking up all of your internet access every night, especially if somebody needs to use it for something else. And then finally, migration strategy. Again, if I'm doing some sort of backup locally, how do I migrate that, if you will? If I've got a series of backups, is there any way that I can migrate that information? You're going to want to plan that out. And then, obviously, you're going to want to select the data that you want to send up. in many small businesses, obviously, we don't back up the operating system, right? That's not worthy of backup, right? We just send up, if you will, the data. And then the final thing is this too, is one of the things you should really look for is something called seeding. When you do the migration, right, the first backup is a very large amount of information. So what you'll want to look for is somebody who will send you, if you will, a device that you can back up to locally. You ship it back to them, and then they seed, if you will, the cloud that way. And the only thing then you ship is the incremental from the date that you backed up until the date that they loaded up into the cloud. This is what I did. Literally, the synchronization process took me less than 45 minutes once they seeded the cloud. And then finally, from choosing a vendor. Again, these are some of the same things that we talked about, if you will, from an email perspective. But remember, if it's free, you're not the customer, especially with online storage. The few that I have seen are free. They do not do trust no one encryption, right? And terms of service and SLA, same exact thing that you're going to look for in email, you're going to look for in online backup. It's even more important, though, here that you're going to look for overage, right? What are the terms, if you will, for overage with that particular provider to make sure that you don't get stuck for an extra 100 meg or 200 meg of pricing, right? So with that in mind, do we have any questions? So you're talking about for online backup. Is there an easy way to calculate your bandwidth needs? Generally speaking, a backup, because of the technology that it uses, it will size to fill your whole pipe, right? So the most important thing that I would recommend when you actually talk to an online, if you will, backup provider is whether or not their client is bandwidth tunable, right? So the service that we actually use for our small business is, right? So I can limit how much actual bandwidth that application can consume as it's sending the information back to the cloud, right? Most of the good providers do that, but a lot of the free services don't, right? And so you can schedule the backup at, shall I say 6 a.m., but let's say, for example, that you did a very big project and you put a new DVD on there that you want backed up, and it goes all the way through morning, 9 a.m., 10 a.m., right? It will consume all of the bandwidth. So look for and ask when you talk to an online provider whether or not you can tune that backup down. Otherwise, it becomes a very complex process of trying to tune your router or something of that nature, right?
A lot of these businesses that didn't exist 2 years ago, so how do we know they're going to exist 2 years from now?
That's a very good question. So one of the things that I look for from a service provider is, if you will, some sort of size and some sort of stability, right? Especially when you talk about things like online backup. Now, the fortunate thing is that a lot of the larger companies, I'll give you an example, right? Carbonite, right? Somebody everybody knows. Something that happens to that particular company is probably going to be an acquisition, right? But I would recommend that you do ask them about that. You do look at the company and determine how long they've been in business. So, for example, that is, and I'll say it, that is one of the advantages that we have as a service provider here at Hawaiian Telcom, is we do have a history of obviously over 100 years of providing service locally, right? And that is something to weigh in when you're looking at these companies. Now, that's not to say necessarily that means that we're going to do it better than somebody else, right? But it is to say that at least from a stability standpoint, the data is going to be there, right? Now, personally, I'll tell you there's a couple of companies that I look at, and I'll mention them here and again with the disclaimer that if you're a small business, these are some of the services that I've looked at and evaluated. Mozy is one, Carbonite is another, Crash Plan is a third. We actually, the choice that I made personally was largely dictated because they supported my specific configuration and everyone else said no, right? It was also, though, that they have a very large user base, customer base.
The new Consumer Protection Agency that's out there is really watching to make sure we're protecting everybody's data. And I don't think really any business goes out of their way not to protect. We want to do that. But when I'm looking for somebody to hold on to my data, are they going to be able to provide to me the same level of service that I'm promising my customer that we're doing? Do I have them sign off on that? Is that part of it?
I would say if you have very specific requirements, right, because the nature of your business is that you're making guarantee about your own customers' data, then I would turn around and take that contract, the very information that I say I'm guaranteeing to my customers, and I would send it to that vendor and say, if you can't meet these requirements, I'm not interested, right? We do the same thing all the time, right? So, because we have requirements that we have to meet with our customer base, we turn around to our own vendors, the people who manufacture equipment, if you will, and we say to them, look, we need to be able to meet these requirements. And that's actually one of the reasons that we did partner with DR Fortress for infrastructure as a service services, if you will, is they were able to meet the requirements that we had and that we had to meet here locally, right?
I think an issue that small businesses in Hawaii have in sending their data to the mainland for DR or backups is the fact that we're here and they're there.
Yeah.
And if we do have a situation, which Sonny pointed out this morning, the lines go down to the mainland, or there's an interruption, and you still want to function here, having a local DR provider.
I agree with you. Having a local DR provider obviously helps. And a lot of that is, what I see 3 years down the road, or if you will, even not even that far down the road, is what's going to happen is there will be partnerships between, if you will, local and mainland. Because obviously the reverse of that is also true, right? We have an event here, right? And obviously, if my data is replicated, if you will, in a secure location in Colorado under 10,000 tons of granite, then that also benefits me, as well as the fact that I have local here. And I think as the services evolve, you'll absolutely see that, right? It's just, traditionally speaking, cost has driven a lot of it in the small business market, right? And it's a lot, shall I say, less expensive to run a data center in Arizona, right, than it is to typically run it here. But we do have local needs here, right, for local data center services. And that's why you're seeing that development happen here. And what will happen is a larger partnership will naturally evolve so that we can provide what we need to locally, but also leverage what's available, truly internationally, and store the data where we need to in the event of, local events.
Follow up to that.
Sure.
Soaring internationally, unfortunately, means your data may be in China and you don't know it. And that should be a large concern.
Yeah, I think it depends on what you're getting, right? So actually, I won't go into it, but there's a very amusing story about an engineer who outsourced his job, his software development job, to somebody in China, and was actually reaping 3 times the salary benefit, yet for only a third of the cost. The interesting thing is after they went through all of his code, it was actually better than his previous performance reviews before he outsourced his job. So there are benefits, but you're right. I mean, it depends on the information. If it's extremely sensitive information that you have, compliance and security requirements for, yeah, you want to make sure that, whoever's storing it is storing it where they meet those requirements, right? But on the other hand, internationally, there's some very good app services that are out there, especially for things like software development, that there's no reason not to leverage, right? Thank you for the time today. I appreciate it.